where we lived here in Wyoming, you know, where our home and basically our business was, tourist business, big game outfitting business, and a lodge for travelers to stay, and one thing and another. About the same time that this was purchased many years ago by my granddad, there was another individual that purchased a cabin about 3.5 miles east of us. So that made him one of our closest neighbors. And this man's name was Ted Ogston. Now he was in the Army, and it was World War I. And when he got out of the Army, he walked into a bus station in Buffalo, New York. He had a yearning to want to come west and experience the West and the lifestyle of the West. Now Ted was about 6'2" or 6'3", and pretty lean and pretty fit. He'd done whatever you do in the Army. And the guy at the train station said, "What can I do for you?" Well, he said, I want a, you know, a ticket, train, bus station. I want a ticket to go west. And he says, "Well, where do you want to go?" And Ted says, "Just reach up on the board and pull a place." So the guy reached up on the board and he picked a ticket for Livingston, Montana. Well, Ted's on his way to Livingston, Montana. Ted detailed all these things to me many years ago. I knew him since I was old enough to know him. And anyway, he pulled into Livingston, Montana, and one of the likeliest places to maybe meet somebody was the local bar. So he met a fellow in the bar, and the guy was a trapper, and that intrigued Ted. And one thing and another, and they struck up a friendship. And the guy was about to go into the mountains and set up his trap line situation for the winter. So he invited Ted as a partner on this trap line. And they set up 3 or 4 tent camps in country, you know. And some of it was called the Hell Roarin', named after, it was Hell Roarin' Creek, because it just, the creek roared like hell. So anyway, they got everything all set up there for the winter, and they spent a winter there trapping, and mostly trapping marten, coyotes, and one thing and another. And it was a fairly great experience for Ted. And during that time that he was there on a beat snowshoe trail, Ted would talk that he would dog trot on snowshoes for 7 or 8 miles at a time. Now this details that Ted was pretty well fit. I did a little dog trotting on snowshoes, not that far, when I was young and I was trapping on a beat snowshoe trail. Ted called them webs. Yeah, that's a good description. That's a good description because, you know, webbed rawhide makes up the snowshoe. Well, anyway, as time went on, you know, into another year, there was an advertisement put out for a want of a man on predator control in Yellowstone Park. Predator control to control coyotes, wolves, and grizzlies. And Ted went, and, you know, with his experiences, having been in the outdoors, and they right off could see that Ted had pretty quickly become a mountain man. And they hired Ted. You know, to be the first man on predator control just after World War I. And Ted walked into a store there. He needed a different rifle. They had a 30-30, but that's not what he wanted. He wanted something different for this predator control work. And Savage had just come out with a new model rifle, bolt action rifle, and they had one of these in the store. And Ted bought that Savage bolt action rifle. It was $253,000. And he bought a case or two of ammunition. And the ammunition was Remington ammunition. It was 87 grain Loveloy semi-round nose ammunition. Now Ted's job was to eradicate wolves out of Yellowstone Park. So Ted Ogston is the man. He eradicated wolves out of Yellowstone Park, and he told me, Randy, he says, there's a possibility there could be one wolf left somewhere, but he said it's questionable. Well, how he did most of this work, you know, he spotted these animals and shot them, you know, but mostly what he was doing, he was shooting buffalo. He would shoot buffalo with a .253,000, and he'd shoot them right in the base of the ear, into the brain pan, and kill them dead. And you know, he'd take his knife and he'd open that buffalo up a bit so it didn't spoil in one thing or another right off the bat. And this would attract wolves and coyotes and grizzlies. Now, as a rule, Ted would be off 80 to 100 yards in a blind watching this baited buffalo for anything that approached, you know, and come in and fed. And as I said, Ted eradicated wolves by this method and walking up and spotting them, you know, in Yellowstone Park, and coyotes. And he killed grizzlies. And Ted told me that he killed 41 grizzlies with 43 shots with that 87 grain Loveloy bullet and that .253,000 Savage rifle. Now, he picked his shot and then right in the base of the ear, into the brain pan, and he liked to have the animal kind of facing away from him a bit so he could go in kind of the back of the head at the base of the ear and go right into the brain pan. So he would wait for the bear to position itself in that angle to be able to have a sure kill. And the only reason that it took 2 shots on a couple of bear was the bear moved a little bit when just as the rifle went off, and he didn't get a the perfect shot, and he had to finish the bear. Well, anyway, he spent quite a long time, you know, doing this, and he was transferred out of Yellowstone Park north to Mount McKinley, Alaska, known today as Denali, and he was, you know, on predator control up there. Now, that was the real cold country, really remote, just as remote as almost as the day was when Ted was in Yellowstone Park. And he had a cabin that he stayed in that part of the country, and he had a citizens band radio, and he ran a trap line. He ran a trap line, and he trapped wolves, and he trapped coyotes, and one thing another. Now, Ted showed me a picture. Ted was 6'2", 6'3", and both arms were as high up in the air as he could reach above himself. And in one hand, he was holding the nose of a pelleted out coyote, you know, a cased coyote. And the other hand, he was holding a wolf. Now the coyote, the tail, holding it by the nose, the end of the tail was just barely touching the ground. Now the wolf that he was holding up, that he had cased out, the head of its hind quarters, about this much of the cased out body portion of the wolf, plus the legs, was laying on the ground, plus the tail. So that made that wolf hide roughly somewhere around 4.5 feet longer, 4.5 feet longer than that wolf hide. This was a huge, huge Alaska gray wolf. And once a month, Ted would get mail. And he was traveling. He traveled the country. He had some dogs in the dog sled, and that's how he traveled and snowshoed where he had to. But anyway, he was not so far, 4 or 5 hours from his cabin, and he met the mailman. The mailman was on the dog sled, and on the upright on the dog sled, he had a thermometer. And he says, "It's 72 below zero today, Ted." Those guys were out in that weather, dressed in animal hides made by Eskimos. Ted wore Ugrit seal mukluks. Now, these Ugrit seal mukluks were made big enough so you could put 2 half-inch felt innersoles in the bottom inside of these mukluks. And he bought the heaviest wool socks that he could possibly buy, and he had 4 pair of heavy wool socks on and those mukluks with those thick felt innersoles. And that's what he wore. That's what he wore in that country. There wasn't a lot of actual walking on anything, riding on the on the dog sled and or on snowshoes and one thing and another. And he described that he was never particularly warm. He was, most of the time he was cool. And he had wolfskin fur, his parka, and just really, really warm. Great big animal hide mitts and one thing and another. And when he met that fella on the dog sled, they heard the drone. They heard the drone of an airplane engine. They couldn't believe it. Well, anyway, late in the day, just right at about dark, Ted got to his cabin, and he got in and he got a fire going and one thing and another, and he turned on the Citizens Band radio, and it wasn't on very long, and there was a news broadcast that came on that Citizens Band radio that Wiley Post Will Rogers crashed their airplane and were killed. Now, they heard the airplane when they were visiting out on the trail. They heard that drone of that airplane. This goes back many, many years. Now, Ted, I believe he spent somewhere like 7 or 8 years or something like that up there in the Arctic, and it was really cold. And by this time, after having been in the cold of Yellowstone and the cold of the Arctic, he was developing some arthritis. And it was debilitating type of arthritis eventually. And Ted was transferred from Mount McKinley on Predator Control to Death Valley, Arizona. Ted told me, he says, "Randy," he said, "they were trying to get rid of me." He says it was 72 below zero, 140 above in Death Valley. He says it was a switch. He says I was there for like 2 or 3 years or something, and he says I was able to put in for retirement, get out of the government situation, and you know, at that time, that's when he bought this cabin. A cabin on the creek, about 3.5 miles east of where we lived. This is how I got to know Ted. His wife's name was Helen. She was a music teacher in Cody, and there was a lot of years that we took medication when we were in the town to Ted at his cabin to help with the pain, the terrible pain with the arthritis that he had in his hands, his knees, his feet, and one thing and another. But he eventually sold the cabin, sold it to a fellow who still has it. He sold it back, oh gosh, the early 70s there somewhere. And Ted lived to be 95 years old. Other than this arthritis situation, Ted was pretty well fit in one thing and another. But I never knew Ted in all the years that he lived at that cabin. He would fish. He'd go to the river and catch some fish to eat. But I never knew him to ever hunt at all. You know, when he quit the predator control, you know, that he'd been on 3 different stints over the years, he basically put his rifle up. And, you know, that rifle, it didn't have a trace of finish on the stock. It didn't have a trace of finish on the metal on the gun. Absolutely nothing. That model was a clip-fed model, Savage. It worked very, very well. It was a very simple, very light rifle. Had peep sights. That's all Ted needed, all he wanted for the country that he was in, things he was doing. You know, the day and age and one thing and another. As things went on, you know, and some scopes were developed and one thing and another, it would never suited his situation to ever have a scope on that rifle. Peep sights was all that Ted needed, and it always did the job for him.